Good day. I'm here to talk about a Romance differential object marking, namely add. I'm going to examine the parameters that underlie this phenomenon, especially looking at the micro variation that seems to exist between the different Romance varieties. So here we go. Yeah, so first of all, Romance and differential object marking is a very big and famous phenomenon. It exists in pretty much all Romance the varieties, as pointed out by numerous scholars. There is this famous quote by Bottentini that says that. All right, I'm going to translate this. This phenomenon, namely differential object marking, exists, and it is differentiated in time, it's continuous in space, and it is found in many different areas in the Romance geography. So this shows that Romance differential object marking is a very big phenomenon in Romance. The two markers here are sort of add and pair. Okay, so add exists in Western Romance, whereas pair is Romanian morpheme. I'm going to focus on add here, partly because I don't speak Romanian, so I can't really do any sort of analysis on pair. And also, it's not really necessary to look at both add and pair in the same analysis because add and pair clearly have different etymologies and hence they have different properties. I mean, numerous Romanian scholars like Monica and Alexandru, have looked at the differences between the add and pair. So, it's not up to me to look at the differences between add and pair. Now, Alexandru Mardale has done some comparisons between the use of add in different Romance varieties, then Spanish, Romanian, and Sardinian. However, a holistic account of Western Romance DOM, looking at all the major varieties, is still missing. So, in this presentation, I propose to look at four major Romance varieties that also have DOM using add. And also, with such a wide geographical and historical distribution, but beyond doubt, I think, Romance DOM goes back to, proto-Romance and Latin, as argued by Sornicola and Fargad and Mardale. All right, so this presentation is about the historical comparative and micro variation of Western Romance DOM. Now, DOM is of significance not just to Romance, but to linguistic theory in general, because DOM exists in many of the world's languages. There's a very famous book by Serzant and Witzlack who look at the typological distribution of DOM. And DOM boils down to markedness. The idea is that certain marked categories can also be morphologically marked. Right, so in the nominal domain, the two main factors are animacy and referentiality. Okay, so these are the some of the well-known clients have been looked at. Just a brief word on them. The lexical semantic properties of noun lies mainly in animacy. So whether the lexical noun is human, if it's a non-human animate, and if it's inanimate. And the more marked it is, the more human it is, the more likely that it's marked. And with referentiality, there are numerous scales like definiteness, specificity, person, so in the first person, second person, third person, number, singular or plural. Also, pronouns, proper names, and common nouns. These are also scales that have been shown to display differential object marking. If you all of these categories together, some people have tried to form a big hierarchy for the nominal domain, something like this. So the pronouns, and then proper names, then human common names, animate common nouns, and finally inanimate. The verbal domain, people have also shown that the more transitive a verb is, the more likely it is that it will display DOM. Okay, and then transitivity is defined here according to affectedness. If we analyze verbs in terms of a semantic primitives, so achievement and accomplishment verbs, they have critically, this component called become, because these types of verbs, they enact change, they cause change in the object, so the object becomes something else. This makes it different from activities and states that do not have this become semantic component. So we can define transitivity in terms of become, and become entails agentivity and affectedness. Classic papers like Hopper and Thompson look at this. All right, so just to illustrate some examples of a Romance ad. There are two main factors, as mentioned in Romance ad, is the animacy and the referentiality of the object noun. So a famous example in Spanish that shows that, okay, so you can say busco a una persona que sabe, or busco a without una persona que sepa usar. Right, so the use of a here, correlates with the mood of the relative clause. And if it's specific, then the relative clause uses an indicative verb, yeah. And here, if it's specific, then a is obligatory. If it's non-specific, then a is optional. It can be left out. And here, it shows that animacy isn't the only factor. Animacy can also interface with specificity in determining the use of a. As mentioned, the verbal markedness also plays a role, and a can be shown to denote some agency and a kinesis in denoting change in the object. So, a famous line proposed by Pottier, also picked up by von Heusinger, etc., shows that in Spanish, matar is much more likely to have a than tener, because matar is a highly affected verb. So, you almost always say matar a. Tener, however, in the sense of to have, it never takes a, because it doesn't affect the object the way that all the other verbs above it do. A very illustrative example is the way that tener can have different meanings that correlate with the use of a. Okay, so when tener in its canonical meaning of denoting a possession, it doesn't take a. So, for example, tiene 12 hijos. Okay, so she has 12 children. But in other senses, you can say que tiene a su madre cerca, consigo, a su lado, etc. So this isn't so much possession as control. Okay, so the subject has his or her mother with him or her. So it can be shown to exert control over the object. And also depicted uses. You can say que tengo al presidente por un hombre honrado. So here, we take the object and we have depicted as something else. So, tengo al presidente por un hombre honrado, etc. And also, we can also use a to designate a particular object. So, for example, estos estados tienen al español como idioma oficial. All right, so these are all ways that, tener can take a in denoting some stronger meanings. And also topicality, and the topical previous objects can also be marked when they are dislocated to the periphery. So Stand Italian, which isn't a non-Romance language, it does show some vestiges of a. So for example, this famous example is Aggiani, questi argomenti non convincono. Okay, so in its canonical position, it doesn't take a. But if we prepose it to the left periphery and the topical position, it can take a. Aggiani, questi argomenti non convincono. Same with personal pronouns. People have shown that a te non ti conoscono, a me non mi hanno invitato. Okay, so we usually don't use a, but if we topicalize it and use resumptive pronoun, we can use a here. Right, so if we formalize it in terms of trees, all right. So here is the verb, and this line here denotes the object and domain. That's selected by the main verb. And according to standard projections, we've got noun, we've got N, we've got Phi-features, and D. Above D, we've got case. Add is normally analyzed as a case marker. Okay, so there's a very comprehensive analysis by Laura Brucker, which shows that add is equivalent to a case marker. We can trigger case by using uninterpretive K features. So these uninterpretable features trigger add. They select add in agreement. So the primary locus has got to be the semantic features of noun. So animacy. If noun is a human or animate, it can trigger Don, as we saw in previous slides. So we can put a UK here. Definiteness and also specificity. So there are various D projections that trigger agreement or movement with noun. These can also trigger Don, as we also saw in the previous slide. If noun is specific or definite, it can also trigger the case marking. Personal pronouns, as we also saw, these also trigger Don. And here we can divide personal pronouns in terms of person and number. Also, proper names. Okay, so adopting some classic analysis by Pino Longobardi. Proper names are D elements, and these can also trigger Don. Right, so in all of these D categories, we can stick a UK feature to account for their correlation with case marking. Similarly, in the verbal domain, okay, so above the verb, we can construct the event and argument structure of the verb by adopting light verbs. Formal analyses have used light verbs to create the event and argument structure of lexical verbs. And here, add is seen in affected objects. So the objects are being affected by an agent. And adopting the standard analyses, we can project the affected objects in spec of affectee, and also the agent in the spec of InitiateP is adopting Ramchan, also Foley's analyses. And here, these projections can also trigger add. Okay, so it's some kind of a spec head agreement relation in effect, and also it can be triggered by the initiate functional head as well, and also in the topical projection, add can also mark topics. So here we also have a spec head agreement between top and a specifier of the topic P that also triggers Dom. So yeah, so similarly we can use a UK feature here. All right. So if we look at the typology of the micro variation of Romance Dom, we start with Spanish. Spanish is a classic example of Dom, as people like Boson have noted. Right, here is a very similar example to the one that we saw some slides ago. So, necesita a una enfermera que pasa. Was it necesita a, or without a, una enfermera que pase? Okay, so the first one is specific. It's a known nurse that she needs to spend the morning with her. The second one, however, it's she needs any nurse. So an unknown nurse to spend the morning with her. But A here correlates with the mood of the relative clause. However, it's put here that A is optional, but no one ever says that it is ungrammatical. With people like Kliffer and Leonetti have shown that A is still possible with the non-specific nouns. So A is optional, but not ungrammatical here. A can also apply to verbs that relate to animate nouns. For example, place names, communities, and also literary or musical works and compositions that relate to the author or the composer. So, for example, a famous example here: Estudia al pueblo de Numancia. Here, this can mean the people who inhabit Numancia. But really, this is a town. Let's talk about the place. So it's not it's not so much about the people as much as about the place. And in the other example, tocar a Beethoven, leer a Virgilio, etc. These denote the works of famous artists. All right, okay. So there's some kind of extended animacy here. An animacy is sufficient for Spanish dom. Okay, non-specificity gives much optionality, but if as long as the object is animate, which also includes communities and compositions, we can use a in Spanish. Animacy is sufficient here. Also, verbal markedness, it's been shown quite widely that, kinesis, in the sense of affectedness, can also apply to inanimate objects in technical prose. So, in these examples, the object is not personified. So, there's no animacy in these objects at all. So, for example, la primavera precede al verano, or las dificultades privan al proyecto, etc. Also, in grammatical prose, el adjetivo modifica al sustantivo, los actos atacan a los metales, etc. So here, verbal kinesis seems to independently trigger DOM because, inanimate objects can be marked by these highly transitive verbs. So verbal kinesis can also be seen as an independent criterion for DOM in Spanish. In Catalan, now Catalan is, as we all know, a closely related variety to Spanish. That makes it a bit tricky to analyze because one always wonders whether it's genuine Catalan phenomenon, whether it's borrowed from Spanish, because nowadays people in Catalonia they're true bilinguals. They speak Spanish and Catalan with a native proficiency. However, despite some normative pressures, people have shown that DOM exists in colloquial Catalan, so we can take DOM as a genuine feature of Catalan, especially in Catalan speech. Now, here are some examples. People have shown that DOM, or rather a, is obligatory for personal pronouns. So there's this example, yo te ayudo a tú, tú me ayudarás a mí, okay. A tú, a mí, etc. Otherwise, with the proper names, common animate nouns, also other pronouns, a is optional. To veure a la María, las monjas no estiman a o Ana, las nenas, etc. Aquí, a vista el níquel, premian a qualsevol o afectará a molts o a tots, etc. So in Catalan, DOM is obligatory only on personal pronouns. Otherwise, it's optional for other types of animate nouns. Similar to Spanish, as you saw on the previous slide, the verbal kinesis can also trigger DOM, because here, inanimate nouns are marked by a when these are selected by highly affected verbs. So, for example, afectará is one of the a la economía mundial. Also in grammatical prose, so el determinants acompañan a los noms, modificar a un adjetivo, and also definition a la biolingüística. So, also Catalan, like Spanish, affected verbs can independently trigger DOM because they show at marking on inanimate nouns. There's a very interesting phenomenon in Balearic Catalan, which is a very specific variety. So, dislocated inanimate nouns can also be marked. So topicalized inanimate nouns, such as this one, so an, aquesta, darrera frase, the frase is an inanimate noun, but when it's being topicalized, it can also be marked by a. So I guess this shows that in Balearic and Catalan, topicality independently triggers DOM because it does so to inanimate objects, which is quite fascinating. Or Italian dialects, which also have many of them also have DOM. It's impossible to look at all Italian dialects here. So Adam Ledgway has done some very comprehensive and detailed work on them. However, there are some general trends that apply to numerous Italian dialects that differ from the Spanish and Catalan patterns that we saw. For example, animacy and referentiality of the noun. The interesting here is that all the analysis of dom in Italian dialects, they all assert animacy. The idea is that inanimate objects can never be marked by am, even if the noun is highly affected. So, for example, this example in Parese, proposed by native speaker Gigi Andriani. Okay, so I can't really say this, but the idea is that the tinsmith melts iron, and here iron, it's inanimate and it cannot be marked by am, even if it's the object of a very effective verb. So Italian dialects seem to have a more nominal type of dom where animacy is crucial. All right. So unlike Spanish, verbal affectedness doesn't independently trigger dom. This also entails that animacy of the object is essential for dom in Italian dialects. Right. There are also some differential patterns here. A is obligatory on personal nouns and proper names. In numerous Italian dialects, personal pronouns and proper names are always marked by a. So, for example, in Sicilian, Neapolitan, Barese, Sardinian, etc. Dom can also apply to toponyms denoting communities, but not literary or musical compositions. So we can say Apple visto a Napoli or soccorrere a la città loro. But different to Spanish on the previous slides, we cannot say legge a Platone. So the extended animacy can apply to communities, not to literary works. Also, common nouns. Common animate nouns are also regularly marked, but they are not obliquely marked as we saw with pronouns and proper names, especially if they lack referentiality. For example, ammazzato a un cristiano. According to my informants, they much prefer not using a here, so simply ammazzato un cristiano. And also, as Andriani points out, if it's indefinite, then the object is optionally marked in Parese. Similarly, with non-specific, so for example, cercava, nu cristiane, etc. If it's a non-specific, then a is prohibited. And similarly with plural nouns, plural animate nouns, these are also optionally marked by a or not at all, as shown in Sicilian, Neapolitan, and Sardinian here. All right, so in Italian dialects, the general pattern is that in dom is obligatory on personal nouns, personal pronouns, proper name, and referential animate nouns. So there are these constraints here that make these patterns of dom smaller than in Spanish and in Catalan. Finally, in the Portuguese, and Portuguese have there's a very specific type of dom, which is the marking of divinity, names of gods, because in the history of Portuguese, this has been shown to be a major criterion for a dom. So if the object denotes a god, and in the act of being worshipped, these can also be marked by as. So for example, temer a Deus, devemos amar a Deus, adorar a Deus, beijo a Deus, etc. So these are all religious idioms where the object is divine and the object is being worshipped, and here a can be used. It can also be used metaphorically. So if the noun is an idol, if the noun is of a social superior rank, then the object can also be marked as if they were gods. So, for example, this very interesting example by Kliffer is respectar a o chefe, a o presidente, a o supervisor, a o professor, etc. So, idols can also be marked by as if they were gods. Also, pronouns. People have shown that the first and second person singular a pronoun can also be marked, and this is a big difference to the third person singular and plural personal pronouns. So, for example, oggi a me, odeo a ti, but otherwise odeo eli, ela, elis, elas, or oggi a nos, oggi a vos, etc. Okay, so Portuguese has a very restricted type of dom, is that only divine names or superior common nouns. Also, some singular pronouns are marked there. Right. So if we go back to the tree that we drew earlier on, so here, we've got all of these functional projections, and we can identify the loci of variation for dom here. Okay, so first of all, yeah, so animacy. So here, there's some, variation there. And, Spanish includes works of authors, also toponyms. With Italian dialects, it's only, human objects and toponyms. So, compositions aren't marked there. Yeah, and also, the D projections that denote referentiality is also crucial, especially for Italian dialects, because as we saw in Italian dialects, it's referential human nouns that are marked. Non-referential human nouns can be unmarked. Personal pronouns are prominent here because almost all of the varieties they mark personal pronouns obligatorily. Even though in Portuguese it's only the first and second person singular. Proper names are also common, although in Portuguese it's only divine figures that are marked by ad. In the verbal and clausal structure, okay, so if we look at this tree again, yeah, so transitive verbs are crucial in Spanish and Catalan, where inanimate nouns can be marked by highly transitive verbs. And here, animacy isn't a factor. The verb itself, the fact that it's highly transitive and affective, these trigger dom. In Portuguese, the verb, if it denotes some kind of worship, which is depicted, these can also denote dom. So in Portuguese, the verb has to carry some kind of worship or respect semantics in order to trigger dom. And finally, topical marking, which is in Balearic Catalan, topical dislocation can independently trigger dom. The fact that inanimate dislocated nouns are also, can also be marked by ad. So these are the keys, parameters here. Right, so here is a table that summarizes, my findings on the previous slide. The idea is that there is an inverse correlation between categories and types here. So Portuguese has the smallest distribution of dom, but this also means that categories in Portuguese that are marked, these are the most marked categories. The idea is that even in Portuguese, a very weak type of dom, these categories are marked. So these are highly marked categories. Whereas Spanish has the biggest distribution, but this also means that it has the least marked categories as far as the differential object marking is concerned. So here is the variation, and this is the scale. So we can form this type of subset and a superset of nouns in Portuguese. So the personal pronouns, first and second singular, divine proper names, and superior common names. These are marked, followed by Italian dialects that have slightly bigger types of objects that are marked. So, for example, third person pronouns, proper names, and referential personal common nouns. And finally, in Spanish and Catalan, we get non-referential personal common nouns, and that are also marked in these varieties. Right. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's such a big distribution. Because beyond that, I think that Tom goes back to proto-Romance and Latin. People have looked at the evolution of ad in Latin that became a Romance of case marker, specifically the Romance of dative case marker that occurs for the indirect objects. So people like Pinkston and Adams, they've collected loads of examples. This very interesting example here proposed by Adams in his papers. Yeah, so here in Plautus captivity, it shows that we seem to have an incipient stage of an ad being used as a dative case marker, because here we get the same verb nuntiare to be announced, being used in the same passage with ad patrem or patri being in the dative. Reanalysis. I mean, it makes some perfect sense that the direction of speech, of announcement, is also the recipient of announcement. So ad patrem here is functionally equivalent to patri here. So we can see the reanalysis, in the process. Elsewhere in Plautus, for example, in truculentus, verbs of vision can also take ad. So, for example, ad eram revidebo. I mean, videre is a two-place verb. They usually take a direct object in the accusative. So, for example, ver vide, sea spring. Reanalysis. Direction of vision equals object of vision. When you look towards something, that thing, for example, vide, is automatically the object of your gaze. So just as ad can be analyzed as a dative case marker, in Plautus, the example to show ad seemingly becoming a direct object, accusative case marker. So we can see the beginnings in the Plautus here. Yeah, so let's focus on verbs of vision because these verbs are actually quite interesting. Plautus truculentus has another example that goes like this: "Respice at me." It's a very short and possibly colloquial phrase. Look back at me. Respice at me, at me. In the classical period, there are also numerous examples. So, in late Republican, in the first century BC, in Cicero's letters, for example, "Nunc ad Caecilianam fabulum spectet." Okay, so let's I fear less that he might watch the play by Caecilius. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, a famous literary example here, ad auras respicere. She wanted to sort of look back at the shores of her homeland. This is the famous myth of Theseus and Ariadne. And Ariadne, in yearning for her homeland after being snatched by Theseus, she looks back at her shores. The Christian era also has numerous examples. So, for example, the Latin Bible, Genesis 4:4, "Respexit ad Abel et ad munera eos." Okay, so the Lord looks back at Abel, a person, a name, and his gifts. Really. In Jerome, however, "ad speaking at me." Another example that shows that a verbs of vision can take ad with the object. Medieval Latin, in the famous Merovingian documents, there are 8 examples of ad being used with ad speaker. Okay, here it's aspexit ad ipso verno. So if we put all of these together, is that verbs of vision plus ad, this construction is attested throughout the history of Latin, from Plautus all the way to medieval Latin. However, there's more to it than that, because both Pinkston and Adams have shown that ad in Latin isn't yet, especially in the earliest attestations, isn't yet a case marker, because they still retain spatial force. They still have this elative meaning of pointing towards a particular thing. So, for example, the famous example in captivity, context makes clear that ad here denotes delivery. So it's not just announcement, but it's a news being delivered to someone somewhere else. So here, hinc in patriam ad patrem. It shows that ad still retains spatial force. And the same can be said about the subdivision, because at era revidebo, context makes clear that I shall revisit our mistress in her house. This meaning of visiting is presumably related to viscera. Viscera does mean visit, and viscera is etymologically related to verbs of vision. Viscera is strongly spatial, even when it takes ad. So for example, visam hung at eo, sifoticod es Tommy. So hung at eo, from here to his house, if he is by chance at home. So this isn't just merely seeing, also visiting. And also in the Cicero example, so nunc ad Caeciliana fabulum spectet. So he might now watch the play by Caecilius in the theatre. So this also denotes some physical displacement. Similarly, with the respice ad me that I showed on the previous slide, context makes clear that this implies rotation, because in the sentence before that, quis illic est, who is there? And so, ego sum, I am respice ad me. So this definitely implies rotation. The speaker is trying to get the addressee turned towards him. And the same goes for the metamorphoses example, because this is the famous myth where Ariadne, after being snatched by Theseus, she yearns for her homeland, and she looks back. She purposefully looks back at her homeland. So respice also implies rotation. So verbs of ad being used with verbs of vision, these seem to regularly denote either traveling or rotation. And this has an effect on the argument and event structure, because the canonical argument structure of verbs of vision, where it's experiencer and stimulus, becomes agent and affectee. The subject doesn't just experience stimulus, the subject has to move or has to turn to see something. So the subject can be said to be agentive, and the object being on the receiving end of the subject vision can be said to be affected as well. So ad here, it seems to create this transitive frame that anticipates romance. Right. In the later period, we get some interesting developments. I mean, Rosanna Sornicola, she's done some foundational work on the Latin and the proto-Romance background to Dom. And she says that, atma objects, they correspond to Latin dative objects. She looks mainly at medieval Italian dialects, and these verbs shown, most of these correspond to Latin objects that are selected by two-place verbs. In Latin, there's a series of objects that take dative as a direct object. So the direct object is marked in the dative. Now, in formal case theory, there is just a traditional distinction between grammatical case and inherent case. This corresponds roughly to the core and oblique case distinctions. I mean, the canonical grammatical or core case are the nominative and the accusative. These are the grammatical case that apply to the subject and object of a particular verb. The most extreme type of oblique case is the instrumental. The idea is that while grammatical cases aren't thematically conditioned, oblique case forms, they seem to be thematically specific. So for example, instrumental always marks instruments, whereas a nominative and accusative, these don't mark particular types of theta roles. The dative is probably somewhere in between. It's a semi-grammatical or semi-lexical. It's grammatical, and it's the default case for indirect objects. However, the dative case in Latin and perhaps universally, it tends to mark recipient, beneficiary, and experiencer. Yeah. So it is thematically conditioned in a way. And of course, these theta roles, they are always human and animate. So we could say that dative objects in Latin are inherently human and inanimate, because they correspond to animate theta roles. Yeah, the most significant of these verbs is definitely servire. I mean, Omar Velasquez Mendoza, and also Blake. They've looked at medieval Latin. They've pointed out that servire regularly takes ad in marking the object. So, for example, this example: Ibi deben servire a Sancta Maria. Servire a Sancta Maria. In fact, there's an early example in Jerome that's goes with this. So in Jerome's letters. All right, so servire normally takes a date object. So servire tibi. This is the standard usage. But however, there is an example, at goes like this. Ad cuius imperio serviebant. Okay, so the heaven and earth and the seas might serve, whose empire or whose domain. All right, so yeah, servire definitely takes ad. In Romance, where the morphological case is lost, so the reflexes of a servire are definitely transitive. Okay, so these take a human object being selected by a two-place verb. So, for example, in medieval Spanish, servir al campeador. In medieval Neapolitan, al señor servire. And also in medieval Portuguese, servir a tal ilustres señores. All right, so that's another key source for dom here. Another very interesting example proposed by Sornicola is clamare, because clamare is originally a three-place verb. It means to shout. And from as early as the first century BC, the late Republican era, there are already signs that ad seems to be competing with the morphological data there, because there's Seneca, the elder, that says clamor mihi ipse. So I shout to myself, clamor mihi ipse, then a clause. In Catullus, in the poem 67, there's atne omnes clamant. Okay, so they all shout at me, omnes clamant at me. So from as early as the first century BC, there's already ad being used with clamare here. In Romance, however, reflexes of clamare are usually two-place, because in Romance, clamare really means to call rather than to shout. So, for example, in Spanish, you say llamar a la and policía. You use a here, but there's only just one object. Llamar a la and policía. In a European Portuguese, that's often conservative. It seems to have retained the old structure, the old argument structure of the Latin verb, and that even if here it means call, so they called him incompetent. But however, the dative clitic here, shamaramlia, which is the dative clitic, it seems to have retained the original three-place structure of clamare here. All right, so from the evolution from Latin to proto-Romance, clamare seems to have undergone an argument change from a three-place to a two-place verb. Now, there are examples in Christian Latin that are structurally ambiguous. So, for example, e profundis clamarigo de ate homine. This is a famous example from the Latin Bible. So here, this literally means from the depths of my heart, I shouted something at you. So clamavi ate, the object is missing here. Or it seems to anticipate, calling. From the depths of my heart, I called you, my Lord. Clamavi ate. So in the absence of the object, it seems to be possible to reanalyze the indirect object as a direct object here. And the direct object here is marked by ad. This is exactly what we have in medieval Romance. So, for example, in El Cid, there are numerous examples of llamar a minaya albar empañe a su sobrino, etc. And the key here is the clitic pronoun is los and law. Los and law are accusative pronouns here. So these show that the reanalysis has already occurred. These are reanalyzed as two-place verbs that take direct objects there. At the same time, in Elfie, there are some examples where llamar seem to denote shouting rather than calling. So, for example, I think that los moros llaman Mahoma y Santiago. Okay, so the Moors they shout, and also the other example, llamando primas primas, so shouting cousins cousins, etc. So the idea is that in the transition from a three-place verb to a two-place verb, Clamara seems to have created a synchronic opposition between human animate objects marked by ad, as seen here, and also inanimate objects unmarked. So this opposition seems to anticipate Romance dom. All right, so there's just a one type of verb that I would like to mention before we finish. So verbs of begging is quite interesting. I mean, in the medieval text, the Chronicon Tanum, there's one example that goes like this. So, ad domino popuscebat. Okay, so she was begging her lord for mercy. Elsewhere in the same text, we get ab. In fact, ab is more in line with classical Latin. So here, for example, popuscebat ab ipsa venia. Okay, so she was begging. At ipsa here denotes the church, and so she was begging the church for her son and mercy. Some orthographic confusion between ad and ab is well attested in medieval Latin. People have numerous medieval scholars have shown this. So here it seems to be the case that ab, like the weakening of the word final consonant, has been confused with ad, and there's this hypercorrect ad being used with the verb of begging here. And of course, this is what we get in medieval Romance. So in medieval Romance, the verbs of begging that express an order or request. These often take a or ad. So, for example, in Spanish, ruegan a rey que, medieval Neapolitan, supplicarono a Giove che lo restituirem. And also in medieval Sicilian, a vui pregu I. However, there's something that's more interesting about our verbs of begging. Is that if we look at these medieval examples again, okay, so these seem to be three-place verbs. Yeah, and they express the indirect object. The person to whom the request is being made. However, there are also examples in all of these texts where there's only just one object, and it's the human object. So we can omit the clause or the noun denoting the request and simply have the verbs the verb of begging taking a human object. For example, in El Fin, a todos los rogaba. The keyword here is los, which is also the accusative pronoun, shows that this seems to have been reanalyzed as a direct object. Whereas in medieval Neapolitan and medieval Catalan, pregamo a te, we beg you. Prega a Deus, so she prays to God. So, in fact, there's an example in process, that goes like this: "Dum cum abste peta." So here, we assume an object. So I shall never seek anything from you, abste. But given that the object is missing, we may be able to turn this around and say, I should never beg you, abste peta. I should never beg you. All right, so similar to clamare, to verbs of begging and praying, these also seem to create this opposition between human inanimate objects marked by ab or ab and inanimate objects unmarked. Right, so if you go through these verbs again and these examples, yeah. Servire, for example, this is a medieval example. The object here, a Sancta Maria, human animate, and is also divine. The idea is that you serve your Lord God or Almighty, and here is the Holy Mary. If we go back to the earlier example in Jerome, so ad quos imperium serviebat. All right, so this is inanimate, but if we look at the subject, the fact that it's heaven and earth and seas, they serve a particular domain. This is definitely cosmic. it definitely has some kind of a divine connotation. So even if the object is inanimate, the divinity seems to be here. Clamare, likewise, in the Latin Bible, so for example, clamavi ate, dom domine, I called you my Lord. So it's human, it's animate, and it's also divine. In fact, in Augustine, there's a famous example, so clamare ad domino. I mean, this doesn't really mean to call in the physical sense. It's really a prayer. It's an invocation. So in a clamare ad dominum, it's a religious idiom that expresses some invocation. And this is retained in medieval Romance, where in medieval Italian, so chiamare adio. Okay, so this is not to call as much as invoke. And also in the medieval Sicilian, so clamao alu primo vincituri. So he invoked the first wave. All right, so the Christian Latin examples here seem to anticipate an medieval Romance, with the human animate but also divine. And finally, with verbs of begging, the fact that these mean praying in the Christian and medieval era. All right, so Moses orabat ad dominum. Okay, so Moses was begging the Lord. So this is a human animate and divine here. Moses was begging the, the, the Lord, which is a divine figure. However, in the Tanum, this one, which is a secular piece of text, the Papa Skepat ad domino. This isn't divine. This is rather superior. Domino here denotes a real historical person who was presumably the speaker's lord, and she was begging her lord for mercy. So this is not so much divine as superior. All right, so the earliest examples of ad in Christian and medieval Latin, they denote human and animate objects, specifically divine objects. If it's re, 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 religious, or if it's superior, it's in a secular context. Okay, so lastly, if you look at the parameters of differential objects marking, classic work on functional categories and parameters shows that all parameters are lexical. That people have been trying to fine-grain parameters as much as possible, and that micro lexical parameters have been argued to underlie bigger types of parameters. So the smallest units of parameters seem to be the lexicon. But however, the evolution of the differential object marking in Romance seems to be so it's perfectly in line with Roberts's and Aruz's account of grammaticalization, because the preposition loses its agreement, and ad becomes a case marker. So P agree becomes K merge, which is perfectly in line with the formal definitions of a structural simplification. Okay, so ad is reanalyzed from being a preposition, a spatial preposition, to a case marker. But as we saw on the previous slides, there's a lot of micro variation even within this lexical change. So for example, in the lexical noun, it can either denote human, animate, or divine, or superior types of noun. In the Phi domain, it could be either all pronouns, or the simply first and second person singular pronoun. Proper names, even though in Portuguese it's only divinity. So there seems to be a significant amount of sub-lexical and micro variation. So even if within this lexical change, there's a higher level of granularity that determine the variation in the Romance varieties. All right, so just to conclude, in Spanish, I would say agradezco a vosotros. So a here is obligatory because the object vosotros is human, person also it's pronominal. So it's a here in Spanish is obligatory. In Portuguese, however, é básico. Eu agradeço a todos em vocês, etc. Now, this is borderline grammatical. The reason being, as we saw in Portuguese, we only use a to mark divine objects. So in order to justify this, I'll need to add a little thing. Quando eu fazer isso como em divindades para mim. Então, eu agradeço a vocês. Finally, in late Latin, it was ad vos gratis ago. Ad posse is both human, animate, and divine. Thank you very much.